The reason I have this first slide is when I'm usually in an audience like this and I see somebody with a PowerPoint and I see bullets on the PowerPoint, I get very anxious and I think, oh my God, 79 more slides of somebody reading the bullet points off a PowerPoint. That's not going to happen here. This is the only one. It's just to remind me never to do that again. What I'd rather do instead is to ask an expert on anxiety to help join us, and there he is. Most people don't know that Charles Schultz suffered from debilitating anxiety and clinical depression most of his life. He really struggled with that. And the way he managed it was by creating a bunch of wonderful small creatures to populate his world and to manage his anxiety for him. And it's a wonderful way to think about how anxiety and depression, especially anxiety, can be a creative force. And we can see that in a number of ways. And I'll be talking about that a little bit too, about how it works and how we can sometimes make the anxiety work for us rather than against us. And we look at that dynamic. So anxiety is different than worrying. This is something to worry about. I worry about it every once in a while, but it's a little bit different because there's actually something there. If the bomb is going off, I'm worried. Okay? So anxiety is much more free-form, and it's much less concrete than most other of those emotions we have. And so there's a real difference. Sometimes we think, when I'm anxious, and my question sometimes with my clients is, are you anxious or are you worried? And if you're worried, let's talk about what you're worried about. And then can we actually do something about that? Because very often it's actually something that we can act on that can actually reduce the worry. Sometimes it's not, and then it's really difficult, and sometimes it gets blended. You know, those of your parents know you worry all the time about children. And then, as Erica talked about, in our culture now, we are creating a culture not just of anxiety, but of worry. You know, I think statistically, this is the safest time for American children to be alive, and this is the time the parents are most worried about the safety of their children. And a lot of that has to do with media and all the other things. We're constantly hearing about things to worry about. One of the ways with my clients also, one of the things I can do when they are anxious is to stop watching the news. When we stop watching the news, we're less anxious, because most people don't realize that the formula for news is start off with something really scary, and then continue with that process, and at the end, give somebody something that they say, oh, this is what I can use to be safe. And that's going to get me back the next day to watch the news again. So our news culture is really part of our anxiety culture. It's creating those senses of doom and gloom. Some of it's real, and some of it's manufactured, and I'll be talking about that a little bit too as well. So worry is a different thing. It's much more focused on this actually might happen. This will remind me to talk a little bit about the psychological aspects of anxiety. Here's a psychiatrist who, free-floating anxiety is probably very good, you know, with a tropical depression. I would recommend that very well. So let me talk a little bit about the psychology of anxiety and even panic as well. The best way that I can really talk about how that works is that we really think about things. The anxiety is something that is sometimes perceived. Now I'm anxious. What really helps reduce anxiety is when something goes terribly wrong, because you say, oh, finally something went terribly wrong, so I knew it was going to happen, so now I don't have to worry anymore because it already happened. See? So that's sort of the mental construct of how we work with this. And why am I holding this microphone? How are we doing now? Oh, okay. I'll just speak this way. I forget where I was now, but that's okay. So one of the things that we know about anxiety, let me really talk most about my clients over the years, because this is really important for me. I've spent 30 years working with people with anxiety, and I really don't understand it that much, and I really struggled with understanding it. But what I can tell you is that the clients I've worked with over the years have been some of the most extraordinary people I've ever known. The word that comes to mind all the time when I'm working with these folks is how courageous they are. How they have such debilitating fears, and they can be paralyzed with these deep concerns, but they still muscle through somehow. And I actually never quite understand, not being anxious myself, or not having that, I actually think it's correlated to IQ, so I think that's why I'm not anxious. So any of you who are B and C students, fellow B and C students, you know who you are. So you know how we used to envy those AP kids? Well, at least there's one thing that we don't have to worry about that they do. So there's something out of that. But the anxiety can be so debilitating, and I talk to folks and I see them that they are struggling so much. So when I get on a plane and I'm in there and I'm really nervous, or I'm not, yeah, I am nervous about people who are going to hit me in the head with their luggage and all the jostling that goes on. But once everything settles down and the door of the plane closes, I relax. I don't have to worry about it. I can't control the situation. I've got some really expert people in front of the plane. We're going to go. My clients who experience anxiety, that door closes and they just, inside, they just freak out. Oh my God, everything that might happen is going to happen. So what we know happens in terms of the thought disorder, what happens with folks who are anxious, in that anxious moment, these very, very smart people, they lose one rational piece, and it's really about risk assessment. What tends to happen for my clients is there's three possible things. There's something that is possible, something that's probable, and something that's likely. And those get conflated. So what becomes possible can become likely. And that's really part of the debilitation. And that part of the brain that, I'm not going to go into hippocampus and limbic system, it's way too early for that stuff. But those parts of the brain that really do those risk assessment pieces for these very smart people, it really breaks down. And so every possible negative outcome can become a likely outcome. So the plane is likely to crash. Can anybody guess how many people right now are probably in the air flying at any given time in the world? Any guesses?
10,000.
10,000. About 1 million are constantly in the air. And most of them, every day, day after day, land safely. Every once in a while, something happens. And that's then, oh, well, see, that's possible. The plane might crash. Actually, the plane is designed not to crash. And that's what it does, and it does it really well. But that thinking can be breaks down because of the anxious state. And so one of the ways we work on that is to ask those three questions. Is it possible? Is it probable? Is it likely? And being able to step back from that often can give them a moment of thinking about that. Now I forget what's the next slide, so we'll see where we are. Oh, yeah. My friend Charlie's back. This seems funny, but actually there was a kind of a dark side to Charles Schultz. He really did have anxieties about his anxieties. He really struggled, and this is the kind of thinking that he externalized. But he would think about, I'm worried about worrying. I'm anxious about my anxiety, and it goes on, and it can be out of control and can get debilitating. And so that's really one of the things that some of those Peanuts cartoons are actually, they're charming, but they're not funny. Many of them are very sad. But what's really remarkable about Charles Schultz, and he's one of the heroes of mine, he really turned that disorder into a wonderful creative process where he entertained millions of people all over the world, even though he struggled. And so there are countless people, especially artists, who are doing that all the time. A number of my clients have been artists, and they struggle with that, dealing with that blank canvas, whatever that canvas is, whether it's painting, whatever, that creative process, and be able to muscle through that and to get through into that point where they can actually create something that's really beautiful or impactful or profound is really, it's life-changing. I'm just always grateful for having the time with my clients to be able to really journey with them as they move through that. I can't imagine doing it myself. It's one of those things that I just see them and I'm with them and say, how do they do it? So I can't stress that enough for those of you who are dealing with anxiety. I'm also a big fan, not originally, but later in my practice, of medication at times, because it really does help to create an opening for people to have that sense of mindfulness, to be able to... Do I have a microphone now? I can't hear you. I'm sorry? The podium mic. Oh, there's a podium. I didn't know. My God, what a great thing. Thank you, Jerry. There's a podium. And it's got the whole thing right in front of me. Awesome. So when we're dealing with with these kinds of anxieties, that medication can be really important. I used to think we don't want to get over-dependent on that, but it really can create that space for somebody to get out there and be able to really think more clearly and to get into a space. So that's an important piece of that as well. I'll keep doing this one because I don't know which button to push on that one. So look at this list. There's no bullets, okay? But here's a list. So what's wrong with the list?
Is it mixing diseases and conditions?
It looks like that, yeah. And in some ways it does. I'm being a little loose with, I have some alternative facts here. We can do that. My answer is nothing really. The way I think about anxiety more and more now, and the way I talk with my clients, which really seems to help a lot, I think that anxiety is an autoimmune disorder of the mind. It functions very much like that. Just like many autoimmune diseases of the body feels threatened, and it over-responds to the threat. And actually then the over-response to the threat itself becomes threatening. And I see a very clear parallel to what's happening with many of my clients who are experiencing that kind of debilitating anxiety, that because so much of it is based in trauma, and for most of my clients, abuse, but I have not had a client who hasn't had as a source of the anxiety some level of trauma. And so that response to the trauma can be an over-responding and a constant hypervigilance that something could happen again. And that's when that cascading effect of the probabilities and possibilities and likelihoods really take a life of their own. So, and when I work with my clients about looking at it as an autoimmune disease of the mind, where the mind is actually attacking itself to try to protect itself, it really is relieving for them because they get to see, I'm not crazy. You know, my mind is really trying to do something really valuable, but it's just not working. And often when they do that, we can create a sense of distance where they can sit back and watch their mind working and then begin. And once we have that sense of we can be internal witnesses of our own processes, that itself can be relieving. Oh, there I go again. This is what's happening. And they can take a step back mentally and see the picture. Oh, this is unlikely to happen. And I have a moment of relief. So it's I think it's a much more powerful model than we have of a disorder, or I'm going crazy, or I'm out of control. They're really not. It's actually very, very smart people trying to do something really brilliant, and they can't do it because they're trying to do too much. So, and of course, often their response to it not working is to do more of what's not working, because that's our second order change. Who's ever been on a diet knows that you know, diet and I gain weight. Well, the problem is I didn't diet enough. Same idea. Same low-level thought disorder of trying more and more as if more is better. And that's really part of that problem. So when my clients can see that it is kind of another form of autoimmune disorder, we can step back and say, I can really begin to think about my thinking differently. And then that's part of the cognitive work that we often do, because that thought gets out of control. So we see it as this is another autoimmune disorder that we can work with. They find it helpful. I don't care if it's true. You know what Albert Einstein once said, what's true is what works. And so I think it works, so now it's true. I have 3 short stories to talk about. I'm going to make a little transition to a different type. I'm moving away now, excuse me, from talking about the anxiety disorders that we talk about from my very courageous clients, to some other things where being anxious. And this is where often my work at Broad Street comes in as well, when we're dealing with different types of people being anxious for lots of different reasons. So my 3 short stories are about saving things. First one is about saving tables. A number of years ago, I was in Berkeley on Telegraph Avenue near the Cal campus. Some of you might be familiar with that. And it was lunchtime, and it was a really, really popular sandwich shop that I was going with a friend of mine, and we went there, and there was a really long line out the door, right at lunchtime, and it was, at first we thought maybe too long, but we noticed the line was moving, slowly it was moving, and then finally we got inside the sandwich shop, and it was a very typical sandwich shop, especially for Berkeley. It had, on the right-hand side, was a whole wall of every different kind of sandwich you can imagine, and every soup, and every salad, and all these sandwich makers, and with the sprouts, and the multigrain bread, and the 27 types of lettuce and everything else that Berkeley is noted for. And so we had plenty of time to study the menu, but then I was looking around and I started getting a little anxious. I could see that the place wasn't really that big, and there were a lot of people in the space. And so I got thinking, like, how's this going to work? I mean, where am I going to sit? What's going to happen here? But I started looking really carefully, and people would, at the front of the line, they would pay for their sandwiches, they would turn around and there would be a seat for them. So I kept looking, how's this working? And I noticed they had these incredible bussers, these 3 guys who were the fastest bussers I ever saw. When you got up from that table was cleaned off and ready to go. And so people would turn around their tray, and there was a table. Something, this is great. This is working absolutely flawlessly. Until somebody in the line, and it could have been me, but this time it was somebody else, realized, this is a really crowded place. There may not be a place to sit. And so this person, with their friend, took their backpacks and saved a table. And there was one less table in the inventory. So the bussers were working as hard as they were working, but now there are fewer places to sit. And so I watched the whole thing just break down as one person had the thought that many of us have. I can see it working for everybody else. Everybody else in the line gets to the front of the line, and there's a place. But when it's my turn, there won't be a place for me. So I better save a place now. And that's what we often do. So many times, we manufacture scarcity. In that case, there was enough for everyone, but then there wasn't. And I often think about how many times do we do that to ourselves and to each other in terms of creating that anxiety, or that moment of anxiety creates this choice that we have. And the choice is, I better take care of myself because it won't be there when I'm there. I'll bet everybody in the room has had a similar experience to that. And then we'll talk about how they all fit together in a few minutes. The second one is about saving mangoes. This is a trickier one. At Broad Street, in the early days of Broad Street Ministry, some of you may know about us, we work with people who are experiencing homelessness and housing and food insecurity and deep poverty. We serve about 80,000 meals a year. And in the early days, back when Jerry was there with me, it was pretty small. And I like to say in those days, we were equally ill-informed and well-intentioned. You know those kind of social, we just really wanted to do the right thing, and we had no idea what we were doing. And our guests gave us a lot of grace and said, well, just keep try to do what you do. So anyway, so we had this idea of, when people are experiencing scarcity, the obvious antidote to scarcity is abundance. It was just clear as day to us. And so we had this deal with Whole Foods, and we could get all the fruit we wanted from Whole Foods. So we had bowls of fruit on every table. Every single table, bowls of fruit. And then people would be taking some fruit, and then we noticed a lot of tension in the room, and it got a little bit, disconcerting. And so we decided, well, the problem is the bowls are too small. So we got bigger bowls so people could share more fruit. And then more altercations broke out and more tension. And then one day, I saw this guy, happened to be a man, was walking around. I'm sure he's a Wharton grad, because what he did is he looked around the room and said, what's the least represented fruit in all the bowls? And he found out it was the mango. So we started walking around all the tables, taking the mangoes from the tables. And then literally, he had a whole thing full of mangoes. And then people were coming up trying to grab the mangoes from him, because then everybody wanted a mango. Then we realized, we started talking, something is wrong. So that's when we realized something is happening here in terms of when we experience these kinds of traumas, the way we protect ourselves can really be also debilitating as well. The third story is about saving inches. Some of you may have heard of Alan Watts. He was very popular a generation or so ago. And he once talked about this great story about the master carpenter and the apprentice. The master carpenter, the apprentice came to work one morning, and the carpenter said, there's no work today. And the apprentice said, well, why not? He said, well, we ran out of inches. And the apprentice said, well, we had plenty of inches yesterday. What happened to the inches? He said, I don't know. We didn't save enough inches. And now today we don't have any, so there's no work today. And of course, as those stories go with Alan Watts, it went on and on about not enough inches and will there be inches tomorrow, etc. And the story sounded a little bit crazy until you start thinking about if you substitute time for distance, that conversation seemed very rational. How many times do you say, there's just not enough time today? Well, we had plenty of time yesterday. What happened to it? Well, we just don't have enough time. We didn't save enough yesterday, so we ran out of it. And so we can see how often the way we talk about some of the things in our lives really don't make sense, but we all think they do. It's like running out of time is the same as running out of inches in some ways. And so these are three stories about how we can, in our thinking and some of our actions, we can manufacture scarcity. For many of our guests, actually scarcity is a very real, in some cases life-threatening situation. But for many of us, not always, but many times, scarcity is something that we have created for each other or for ourselves. And so we want to be thinking about when you're feeling anxious, sometimes when I'm feeling anxious, what I try to do is identify where is the scarcity in my life in this moment and what can I do about it or with it? And is it real? Is it true? And sometimes it's that sense of, it's like the mangoes or it's like the tables. They're really not scarce, there's enough. And so what we learned about that, the antidote to scarcity is not abundance. And it took us a long time to learn it. And it's a very difficult thing to learn and to trust. And the antidote to scarcity is enough. We actually have enough most of the time, not all the time. So when we're thinking about our folks, when I talked about my clinical clients, very often that's their sense of, I don't have enough safety, I don't have enough whatever I need in this moment, there's not enough. And sometimes that's true, but many times it's not. And that's the key. For most of us, we're feeling that low-level anxiety, the same thing. Sometimes it's true, but most of the time it's not. And if we can look at ways, how are we not taking care of each other to make sure that that doesn't happen, and that anxiety that we often manufacture is created, we can take a step back and say, is it true, and is there another way to perceive what we're doing with our lives and with each other? This is, I think, the darkest picture I have, and this is another indication of just how difficult not only Charles Schultz's life was, but many of the folks I work with experiencing kind of clinical depression and anxiety. It's a very, very dark picture for them. They can often live very difficult lives in the shadows. And my work with them is to bring it out, to say there's a fierce beauty that I see in my clients and also in people in my personal life. I just can't tell you enough how much I admire them for their ability to really persevere in ways that I could not imagine. And that's really my message today, is how much there is of that fierceness, and just a way of really working through that darkness and finding that light and trying to find the hope that's out there that I know is there and there's enough. So there's another way of looking at it, a more hopeful way. If we can begin to see, and part of that is to be very mindful. In this picture, this is the situation I'm in. Here I am. And what is that about? And how we can be much more grounded and working with each other. So when you're with someone who's experienced anxiety, many of you have close friends know this, the last thing you do is to say, cheer up. Okay? Don't say it's going to be okay. Everything's going to be fine in the end. The best thing to do, I think, when we're with folks who are experiencing that kind of anxiety is to be like the little bird. I forget his name or her name. Is to be with thank you, with our friends and with our loved ones. To be with them and to not try to take anything away from them, but to try to add to their lives. To try and say that this is, I'm with you. I don't have to understand. A professor once said, you don't have to be a hen to understand an egg. I don't have to understand everything, but I can be with you and I can journey with you. I can love you and support you. And you don't have to be different. And there is hope for you in your life if we try not to take things away, but to add to their lives. So I'm afraid I might run out of inches, so I think I'll stop here so there's enough inches for all of you to ask any questions you might have. Thank you all so much. It's great talking to you.